Welcome back to the Conversations on the Decalogue. We are now on we'll say verse 8 of Exodus 20, also known, as far as Lutherans break it down, as the third commandment. This is regarding the Sabbath. A little more words, a little more text to this one in Exodus 20. We hear it this way. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that was in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Luther in the Catechism says this, third commandment, thou shalt sanctify the holy day. What does this mean? Answer, we should fear and love God that we may not despise preaching and his word, but hold it sacred and gladly hear it and learn it.
What translation of catechism are you using there, Dan?
It's just the one it's whatever one is just on the bookofconcord.org.
Oh, that's the Bente.
Bente
translation.
Yeah, that's the one I'm using because it's convenient on the
that explains
internet.
The 1895 jargon.
There you go.
Yeah.
I can use a different one in future if you'd like me to.
No, it's fine. I was just curious.
So this one has all kinds of questions attached to it. Like, hey, why aren't we going to church on Saturday? All kinds of questions on like, man, this seems really strict. One of the things I think is interesting about the Sabbath day is that as time went on throughout the history of Israel, God gives you this day so you don't work, because you might just like kill yourself working, right? So in the midst of a fallen world, you have this one day where it's like, maybe this you need a day where you rest. It's a day of rest, and you're going to devote this day to the Lord. And what are you going to do? Like, you're going to meditate on his word, and you're not going to work. And so you sort of have this don't do anything. And of course, what do people do? They focus on the word do anything and try to figure out what doing is and what anything is. And then let's make sure, and then you figure out a way to make this the worst day of the week. I mean, when you read the Gospels, you're like, man, you guys really took this day and made it just probably a day that everyone was dreading. I mean, just make sure, like, the pressure you feel to not do anything. I mean, can you imagine this? Like I said, don't do anything. You're like, oh my gosh, this seems impossible. This says something about how deeply flawed we are, where we hear don't do, and we immediately are like, what does it mean to do? Like, we got to make sure that we're not doing that thing.
Yeah. When I studied at Hebrew Union, and one of the classes I took was on the tractate Shabbat for the Palestinian Talmud. And I can remember sitting in class the first couple of weeks thinking, man, this feels like I'm in the first century again. Yeah. Because all of the discussions of the rabbis recorded in the Talmud about the Sabbath, it felt like it was lifted right from the pages of the New Testament. You know, how far can you walk from your house? Yeah. What kind of utensils can you use?
The city of Irvine,
fire, not light a fire, all that kind of stuff.
Concordia University, Irvine has a fairly large Jewish community, and across the like light poles and there's no electricity poles in Irvine. It's a planned community. Everything's underground. But across the street light poles, there's a thin wire on some of them that you can see. And I always wondered what it was, and come to find out some years later that it defines the area that you can walk from your house to, I was going to say the temple, not the temple, the synagogue. Yeah. If you are, observing Jew. And I was like, wow, yeah, okay.
Yeah, very, very, very strict. I mean, all kinds of, basically everything about your daily life, with regard to what you wear, what you eat, what you can touch, what you can and cannot pick up, how far you can travel. All those are laid out in just excruciating detail in all these early Jewish writings.
And this is all fence building, right? So you're looking at these words, labor and don't work, and then you're trying to figure out what would constitute labor. And so you you don't want to get anything close to labor, and so you build a fence outside so you don't ever get close to it, right? And so you add on all these rules. So you're like, well, how much could you lift? How far could you walk? What could you do when it wasn't considered labor? And you're like, that's an interesting way to view labor. I know for me that there's a lot of things that I do that are physical that I wouldn't consider labor. They're things that I enjoy, right? But this is not how this is read at all. Not that, hey, the labor, the sweat of your brow, the things that you do to put food on the table, that kind of stuff. You should have a day where you don't have to do the things that are demanded of you, the things that you have to do to survive in this world. Instead, that you build this fence and you make it to where, could you pick up your kid? I don't know. It's terrible.
Yeah. I mean, it was designed as a gift, right?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it is a command, of course, to remember zakar in the Hebrew, which always has, as Dan and I talk about a lot on the podcast, zakar always involves an active sense. So you're not just like wake up and you're like, oh yeah, it's a Sabbath day, I remember that. I mean, there's an activity to zakar, but it just so happens that this particular activity is remember not to work. So the activity is not to do activity, whatever that activity might be that qualifies as work. So I mean, there is that, like we've seen with the other commandments, there is almost there's a built-in implicit grace element to it, gift element to it. God is saying, listen, I'm going to make you different than all the other nations. And the Sabbath there was nothing like it in the ancient world. I mean, some have made certain arguments that some cultures might have had one day a month or something like that. But most of the time, especially if you were a servant, well, you just worked
7 days a week. Yeah.
You worked 7 days a week. I mean, this was an issue even for the Jews living in the Roman world. Exceptions had to be made for them because they didn't work on the Sabbath day. And most of the time, Rome allowed that, just a religious exception for them. But there were no Roman servants that got Sunday off or Saturday off. You just worked your butt off 7 days a week. It's what you were there for. You were a servant.
Well, it's fairly telling that God has to command us to rest, isn't it? I mean, think about this, that he's like, I'm going to have to include in these words that I'm giving you a command that you're like, it reminds me of when I think I brought up Psalm 23 in every single one. I need to figure out the connection between Psalm 23 and the 10 Commandments, apparently. But Psalm 23, when he says, you make me lie down in green pastures, and I always thought about that make me, like as in like you can lie down in a green pasture, or you can be made to lie down in a green pasture. Like God's going to make you do it.
Because he assumes my friend David Ruffner's on that hiking trip, and he's going to be like, the next ridge is just over there.
Yeah, and God has to tackle you down into some rest. So like right here in like the heart of the law, you see this command where God's like, also, you're going to need to have a day where you rest, because even I rested on the seventh day. So there's always, as I read this, I always see this this sort of holying of rest, because I think a lot of times we can think of like, well, rest feels lazy and you should always be doing something and all this kind of stuff, but God sort of takes that idea away from you and says, like, well, even I rested on the seventh day, and that rest is a good thing. And so he sort of takes rest out of a category of idleness or something like this, and says, no, you can have a day set aside where you could just rest, especially if you're resting in the idea that I rested. So this is part of the kind of resting in God, and this is why you'd be meditating on His Word and this sort of thing as well. But yeah, so that part I think is good, and that you have to have God say that to you, because you won't come up with it on your own.
Yeah.
Well, I think we assume that the ancient world is like the modern world, where they've gone through several labor movements and strikes and protests against bosses who wanted you there every second of the day, and have made sure that children aren't there. And we assume that they're like this, that they have the norm is a 5-day, 40-hour work week. And I mean, The reason we're able so frequently to sort of disregard the third commandment is because so much of our lives is about binging Netflix, which is rest, and not about doing other things, right? Not about making sure that we're up at 4 a.m. to go check the crops, because if the crops don't come in, we're not going to eat, and all that kind of thing. We underestimate how much leisure there is in our lives. And that's why we can sort of take this for granted.
Right.
Yeah. I find it fascinating that in the two versions of the commandments, you have this in Exodus 20, then Deuteronomy 5. This is one of those places where the reason for the commandment diverges. So in Exodus 20, it's remember the Sabbath day. And then the reason you remember it is connected back to creation, right? But then when you get to Deuteronomy chapter 5, the reason is different. So you remember the seventh day, and then it says in verse 15, you remember that you were a slave in Egypt.
Yeah.
And the Lord your God brought you out from that.
Yeah.
But I mean, what I love about those two is they're just two sides of the same theological equation, because redemption is always basically an activity of creation on the part of God, or recreation, if you will. So it's not like you remember it for two different reasons. You're really remembering it for the same reason. It's just different ways of looking at that same reason. So God creates and he recreates. He creates and then he redeems, but his redemption is always a version of his creation. And I mean, what made me think of that is, Scott, what you were talking about as far as all of our leisure. Well, they had no leisure in Egypt.
Yeah, zero.
They're working their butts off all the time.
They weren't forming unions over
there. Yeah, there were no unions.
Maybe
they should have.
Pharaoh.
From what I've read, they outnumbered the Egyptians.
Yeah, right. So God's like, hey, remember when you were in Egypt and you worked 9 a day, 365 days a year? Well, when the Sabbath comes around, remember that and enjoy the rest that I'm giving to you.
It's the Deuteronomy 5. It sticks out to me a little bit more, but it's the same. I mean, you can see it in Exodus 22, but it's basically like God saying, "Hey, get off the backs of the people that you have some power over for a day, huh? Or the people and the things that you have power.
Even the animals, man. Like, give my creation a break once in a while.
Yeah.
Like, come on, man. You're ridiculous. Just get off their backs a little bit. If I turn my back for a minute, you guys go full tyrant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and all of this is kind of helpful background when you jump to the New Testament and you see the Sabbath, all of the kind of the Christology and the salvation kind of theology that's embedded within that comes to full flower there, right? I mean, the verse that immediately comes to mind is when Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Or Hebrews, chapter 5, where he goes into this long discussion of rest. So he talks about the Sabbath day rest. Then he talks about the rest that Joshua partially delivered to the Israelites when he brought them into the promised land. And then he brings up Psalm 95, where it talks about rest again. And then he finally says, but listen, none of these rests really lasted or counted, because the Sabbath rest that we have in the Messiah, in Christ, is really the rest that all of these other ones were leading us to. So in that way, the Sabbath commandment is sort of what would you call it? A calendrical prophecy, or a ritual kind of prophecy of the work of the Messiah. So I mean, we've seen this multiple times where, it's the 10 commandments, the 10 words, and we usually take this as all law, and it is law. But when you kind of read between the lines and you view it in light of Christ, there's a whole lot more there than simply a list of shalls and shalt nots.
Well, yeah, you see this in the life of Jesus. I mean, the Sabbath seems to be the thing that the Pharisees really think they're going to nail Jesus on. Like they got to prove this guy is a real antinomian. They really are after this, and they feel like the Sabbath day is the one they're going to get. Like, right, they're going to get him on this one, right? And so you have this situation where he'll heal someone on the Sabbath. And they'll
on purpose.
On purpose, yeah. And they'll be freaking out about like him, and you see his attitude towards them is, dude, restoring this person hasn't rested for who knows how, like a leper or some blind person. Like they've been. I've restored this person. It's the most Sabbathy thing that you could ever. I've given this person the ability. Yeah, I'm giving them an ability to rest, man. And you see one of my favorite. I think it's in Luke where he heals someone on the Sabbath. They freak out. Then he like blows them up with this. Is it not lawful to do good on the Sabbath? Thing, and they all shut up, and then they try to figure out how they're going to nail him. And then like the next chapter, he sees a guy on the Sabbath, and he looks over to the Pharisees and says, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath?" And they don't say anything. They're just like, I feel like there's a trap. Like we got owned hard in the previous exchange with him, and then he does it again. And so what's interesting about Jesus looks like he's always looking to perform a restorative work on the Sabbath. Like he loves doing good things for sinners on the Sabbath. He in Jesus' mind, as the one who wrote this with his finger, this is the ultimate thing to do on the Sabbath is just to provide this restoration of people. I mean, the word is in there, right? So
Mark 2 account of the Pharisees trying to keep him, just nail him on the Sabbath, saying, look at these guys over here. They do what is unlawful to do on the Sabbath. He can't be who he's claiming to be or who they are claiming he is. And he gives out the account of David as he just like on the Sabbath strolls in and eats what we would call the consecrated bread, right, which is only lawful for the priest to do, and then turns to them and says, the Sabbath was not made, or the Sabbath was not made for the Sabbath was not made for man. Jesus, I'm really messing this up. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. But the next line that he says in verse 28, I think is even more important. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And he's like, if you want to know the clarification of this, go ahead and get it from the mouth of the person that wrote it down in the first place. I created this day for you. I didn't create you for this day. This day is for you to rest. And now, I mean, I think we should get into too the sort of the worship elements that are certainly part of this. But on the whole, this was because people were despising rest, not even taking a day to worship Yahweh in that, right? Despising rest and having rest despised for them, right? Or imposed on them. And to protect, this is like all things, this is to protect us from ourselves and to protect other people from us.
Yeah. I think part of what I love when Jesus says that man was not made for the Sabbath, and that he then follows it up with that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, right? I mean, essentially what he's saying there is that the law is not God, I am, right? So you can't have this hierarchy where the top thing on the hierarchy is the law, and then there's God who's like subservient to the law. This is not how this works. He's like, dude, I wrote this for you. I don't need you to interpret it for me.
Well, is Lord even of the Sabbath, right? I mean, this is.
I'm high. He's higher. I am higher than this.
You guys think that this is the top. Let me tell you, I'm Lord even of that. I spoke this. These are my words.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, maybe we should, so we don't go extremely long, get into the worship element of it. I mean, obviously, Chad, the Sabbath is Saturday. Protestants, just not just Protestants, Christians everywhere, would worship on Sunday, with the exception of a very few. Now we can get into that, but I actually don't think the day is important. That really, I don't think it really ultimately matters that much. I understand the reason for it. We can go into it, but part of what's going on here is what that. Well, how did the Jews understand this as a day of worship initially?
Yeah, actually, I wish that we knew a little bit more about what happened, just maybe in a Jewish family or an Israelite family, say, around David's time. on the Sabbath day, but we really don't. We know there were Sabbath sacrifices that were offered, as there were every other day of the week. And there were certain Sabbaths that were holier than other Sabbaths, kind of festival kind of Sabbaths. So most of what we know about Sabbath worship in the Old Testament is directly temple related and not like village or home related. We know a little bit more once we get to the first century. Now, when you kind of move forward, say after the New Testament, I think it's important to talk about what constituted early Christian worship, right? I mean, did they continue to worship on the Sabbath day? Did they worship on a different day? And there are extremely early records from, for instance, Justin Martyr, who was an apologist of the second century, where he already talks about Christians worshiping on not Saturday, not the Sabbath day, but the Lord's day, so on Sunday. So the earliest records that we have, and he's not the only one among the early fathers, the earliest records we have indicate that, I think quite shockingly, that the followers of Jesus moved pretty quickly away from Sabbath worship in order to worship on the day of the resurrection. Now, I say quite shocking because, I mean, this is the Sabbath, as we can tell from the New Testament, the Sabbath was at the core of Jewish religious identity. I mean, this was circumcision and Sabbath were kind of the two big markers of who the Jews were in well, not just first century, but all the years prior to that as well. So for them, in other words, for them to move away from Saturday to Sunday was a huge change.
Well, it's
I think it just indicates how important the resurrection was. Yeah,
shift. Not just a worship schedule shift. This is a major cultural shift.
Yeah, exactly.
This isn't like going from 9:15 worship to 10:20 worship.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think it gets to just how impactful the resurrection was in every aspect of the early church's life. The resurrection was everything, and it was enough to actually change the way that they worshiped. Because of course we know the early church was almost exclusively Jewish. Of course, as time went on, more and more Gentiles came in, but it's still in the second century it was still had a very heavy Jewish influence. So for them to say, "Hey, we're not going to worship on the Sabbath; we're going to worship on Sunday, the day of the Lord's resurrection," just underscores how much the resurrection changed everything, because they wanted to actually gather as this worshiping community, not according to their Jewish heritage, but now according to the heritage of the resurrection.
Yeah. I mean, so part of it is just sort of establishing or trying to show a distinction between the what was old and what is now new. Then obviously there's all kinds of theological symbolism going on with every Sunday worship service is a mini Easter. I mean, again, we are like this is what happens, right? It's a mini Advent, it's a mini Easter, it's all of these things. And so that every Sunday you go in and you are celebrating the fact that Christ has risen, and in that resurrection, you are guaranteed to rise again from your own death and all of this. It's sort of obvious that there's not a command to worship on Sunday. That's never been given to us, and it's sort of something that the church has decided to do for, I think, good reasons. But also, we would say then that there is a strictly Jewish part of the Sabbath law as well. So we would make a different distinction between sort of the moral law of God and the ceremonial law. The Sabbath day is a little bit weird because things kind of get a little mixed up, right? And that you get a little bit of both. And there's parts of it you'd be like, yeah, the day is not as important, right? We're not Jews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think Paul already gets to talking about this in Colossians, right, where he says, "Let no one judge you with regard to food and drink or to a Sabbath." Right. So I suspect already in the New Testament they were moving away. I mean, we don't know for sure, but I think probably already in the New Testament there was a move towards Sunday because of the resurrection,
and probably a move to celebrating fewer of the Sabbaths, plural.
Yes.
Too,
right.
from the Jewish calendar. What about the idea of Christian Sabbatarians. I mean, people that are Christian yet decide to observe the Sabbath, even if it's on Sunday, observe the Sabbath in idea rather than in day of the week, right? Where they're taking a day where they're specifically resting, they're trying to prepare food ahead of time and everything. What about that? I mean, I know but I want to put it as a question.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear from you. I mean, my approach to that would be if they decide that is going to be kind of their own, what I want to call it, spiritual discipline that they are exercising, not out of any kind of legality or not imposing that on somebody else, but they freely choose to do that and use that time for prayer or worship or whatever it is, I'm fine with it. But what I've seen over and over is that these things tend to slip into legalism and kind of a superior righteousness. I mean, I don't have any specific examples of that, but I've seen some others who are kind of in those sorts of kind of recapturing our Jewish roots movements where that tends to happen.
Well, there's a big community. So my friend Dave Ruffner lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and there's just a big community of Sabbatarian Christians from the Reformed perspective there. And it's, it's a law. It's a law. It's on the whole, they worship. A lot of them worship twice on Sunday, and there's, it's hard to speak against it because it sounds like you're speaking against a good piety in a sense, a pious practice of dedicating time to family and to worship of the Lord and to receiving the gifts and that kind of thing. And so I don't ever want to be put in the spot where I'm trying to explain to people that they ought not do that, that that's not a good thing. I mean, of course it's a good thing to set aside time to receive the gifts, to focus on the proclamation of the gospel of Christ for you, to receive the sacrament, all these things. These are all to spend time with family, even to turn off Facebook for a day. All these things I'd say are beneficial, and if done in Christian freedom are even more beneficial. But the tendency once something becomes a law that you automatically fulfill because of societal pressure or whatever is to believe that you're earning something on the basis of fulfilling that law. And therein lies, I think, the possible danger here. You set yourself apart from others who are not this or not doing this as better, more holy or some such thing than they, which of course you're not. And of course is not the purpose, I don't think, of the third commandment. There's a dual purpose, which seems, especially for us, kind of obvious here. It's that setting aside time for peace and rest and for the benefit of others, and setting aside time to come together around the gifts and the promises of Christ.
No, yeah, I love Luther's explanation of it, which, I mean, he really simplifies it, right? That it's that we should fear and love God and not despise the preaching of his word, and instead of despising it, that we would hold it sacred and that we would assemble and gladly hear it, right?
Yeah.
And hopefully what you're going to hear when you hear that word is that Jesus is your Sabbath rest. I mean, this is what you're going to hopefully hear.
When I was in confirmation class some years ago, what the pastor at the time, he was pretty good at this stuff, and he would, he explained the third commandment when we'd come together for confirmation class. This is the third commandment. We're not despising preaching in his word, but we're gladly hearing and learning it. And it's all part of that. I mean, you celebrate the Sabbath every time you take a moment to explain a question to your child that they have about the faith or about the scriptures. And that's Sabbath rest in that moment. The particular thing is that the people of past times wouldn't have had the leisure time to take that moment to explain these because they'd been working to put food on the table. And so God is saying, take at least this time, people. Like, store up on this day so that you can at least take this day. That's not so much an issue for us. On the whole, that's not so much an issue for us. And if it is, it's usually like half choice. To be a workaholic is usually half your choice, at least half your choice.
Yeah. And kind of Scott, back kind of like to Chad's point, combining your point and his point that he made earlier, which was in the Deuteronomy version of this, where you have this reference back to the the God who delivered you from
Right.
Egypt, right? So God is carving out a space for one generation to to remind the next generation who he is and what he's done, right? And so this is one of the purposes of this day, and that's why it's, I think, partially why it's phrased differently there, is that you take this day, I'm gonna create space in this life that you'll just work for you to remind your children, and for you also to remember again who I am, what I've done. And this goes all the way back to the stuff we've talked about previously, right? So that iniquity may not be visited upon this generation and the generation after that, and this sort of thing. So all this ends up coming back to God's name, who God is, what he's done. A lot of this has to do with that. And when you talk about the commandments being for our good, especially as the ones we've discussed so far, a lot of these have to do with remembering the goodness of God and who he is and what his disposition is and the good that he has done and wants to do for you.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what their habits were by Exodus 20 as they had, not too long ago been delivered out of Israel or out of Egypt? I mean, and then can you imagine that that's their normal, right? That they don't know different from that. From that constant grind. They don't know anything other than that. And so he's even, seems to me, foreseeing that as they set up civilizations of their own and establishments of their own and cities of their own, that there's a bit of a worry that their current normal is going to be carried over to be their new normal, and that when foreigners come in their lands, they're going to impose this on them, and that when they have children, it's going to be imposed on their children too, and that when they have servants, their servants will have to work 24/7 as they did. And that their children won't get a minute of rest either. And so he's trying to say, I've delivered you. Now let me help you deliver those who come under your care.
Yeah. I mean, Scott, this is first given to them as they're wandering around the wilderness for 40 years. He literally gives them a day, like, you need to stop walking for a day because you're going to be doing this for a while.
Right. Yeah.
I love the wandering for 40 years. What's the square mileage that they're wandering for 40 years?
He has to give the Sabbath just so they don't walk themselves to death, man.
Yeah, right. Kind of take this back to one of the first points we talked about. I love to point out the fact that when you get to the end of the creation account, which is into Genesis 2, and God rests on the Sabbath day, he declares it holy. Now, this is the first time. The first thing that God sanctifies in creation is not a person or a place, but it's time. And what I love about that is that God says, okay, this day that I've sanctified is a day of rest. I don't want you to do anything on this holy day. And I think kind of implicit in that is that holiness and rest are not something you achieve, but something that's given by God. So he sanctifies the day of rest and says, all right, don't do anything. And it's this day that's holy. It's not the days when you're out there working and accomplishing and laboring, but it's this day in which you rest in my promises and rest in my work that is truly holy. And by keeping this day, you remember the fact that it is holy and that I give you the gift of holiness. It's not some sort of achievement, but instead it's my present to you.
Yeah. And it's a remembering of the game changer that's being passed on, right? Again, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery.
Yeah.
This is now who you are. You're not slaves anymore. By the way, I'm going to give you a day to remember that you're not a slave. And I want you to remind the people that are in your care that they're not slaves either.
Yeah.
But they once were.
Freedom. Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll leave it there. This one's went a little longer, but it's been good.
Just wait till we get to the fourth commandment, my favorite.
Yeah, Scott has a lot to say about honoring fathers, so we will get to that. Yeah, and these get a little more short and punchy. So a little punchier going forward. So, all right. Well, we'll see you guys next time.
All right.